Colleagues, it is with great pleasure that I ask you to join together to welcome Dr. Stuart Shanker.
Rin has absolutely forbidden me. I'm not allowed to talk about physiology, psychophysiology, or brains today. So thank you so much. I need to self-regulate too. I've been up for a while, so forgive me for sitting if you can't see me, but I'm too tired to stand. My day started off in a real interesting way today. And I want to use this to try to persuade all of you to take a key role in this initiative that we're rolling out in BC. So I'll explain the thinking behind it first and then try to persuade you to commit. All right. So my meeting this morning was I want to be debriefed on the Amanda Todd situation. And of course, what we're particularly worried about is the aftermath. This thing went viral within just almost instantly. And I guess you've all heard, but right across the province, there has been a wave of suicide threats, vigilante threats. So it's a very disturbing situation right now. It'll calm down. But that's not the part I wanted to talk about. What I wanted to talk about was one line that this senior ministry person said to me. She said that her sense was that the problems with children are imploding. That's what she said. And that's our sense. Now, this is a very difficult thing to talk about. We don't have the kind of data that we need. I was talking to Jeff Stewart this just 2 seconds ago, and Jeff's going to try to help me get a little bit better data than we've been using. What we rely on when we look at this are the sorts of hard prevalence studies that are done by reputable medical organizations. Okay, so I'm going to give you just a few statistics. I don't want to do too much because everybody's in sort of a good mood. Okay, you all know that the autism data has been dramatically lowered. It's now pegged at 1 in 88. But did you know that when that report came out in May, New Jersey reported 1 in 49? Anybody know that? It's funny, this is big news down in the States. It wasn't covered up here. In fact, the governor of New Jersey was on the news every night for a couple of weeks saying there's nothing particularly toxic about New Jersey. That's true. He was right. His argument was that what's really going on is that New Jersey keeps better records. And I think that's true. And Fraser Mustard and I worked for Fraser for many years, and Fraser and I did a study in Northern Ontario where we went from door to door, and we knocked on doors and said, have you got kids? Can we see your kids? And we came up with about 1 in 38. All of our prevalence data on autism is based on medical records, hospital records, or physician's records. It's not a true general population survey, and that's misleading because we know that there are so many families that don't go see their physician. Anyways, we weren't allowed to publish that in earlier study too for various reasons, and I think they were probably right. It wasn't done rigorously enough. But that study that we wanted to do was in fact published last year by 2 Yale scientists. Kim is the lead author, and they reported 1 in 38. Okay, so what's going on here? Is there an epidemic of autism? No, there's not. My suspicion is that the core number of children with autism is probably about the same today as it was when I first started studying autism in the early 1980s. But there are a couple of things that are going on, and one of them is that we've relaxed the diagnostic criteria so that many children are currently diagnosed with autism that 20 years ago would have been diagnosed as having a regulatory disorder or PDD. And there's greater public awareness and a lot of misdiagnosis too. But actually that doesn't concern you guys, because your concern is a school system that is bursting at the seams at 1 in 88. That's your concern. So however you want to describe it, if you want to argue that these were children that a generation ago would have been labeled as having a cognitive impairment, the fact is that you've got a situation today where teachers are reporting, in the old days, I didn't have any kids on the spectrum, now I've got 2 or 3. This is a significant load on the teacher. And that's a small part of the story. A study came out in June or July from the CDC in Atlanta. This is an important study. We've been tracking ADHD since the early 90s. And ADHD was growing every single year at around 3% a year, 3% growth in prevalence. If you haven't seen Ken Robinson's TED Talks about this, Ken Robinson had some very good explanations of this phenomena in the US where the prevalence goes up as urbanization increases. I'll come back to that in 2 seconds. So in 2003, something happened and the growth rate jumped from 3% to 5.5%. And it has stayed ever since at 5.5% growth in ADHD every year, putting the current general prevalence at around 12%. Okay, so it's the same story. It's the same. We have to have the same qualifications here. We know that a lot of these children are possibly, they're hyper. There's no doubt about that, but probably not what a clinician would regard as a hardcore ADHD child. But that's irrelevant, because once that kid gets that diagnostic label, everything changes for that child, everything changes for that family. And now we've got this teacher who's coping with a couple of kids on the spectrum, and now 3 or 4 kids that have been labeled as having some sort of a hyperactivity disorder. Why do I stress hyper? Because that's actually not the most serious concern we have. The most serious concern we have is ADD. There have been a couple of very large-scale prevalence studies done on ADD. And the most recent one done in Canada was by a guy called Pingot. It was Pingot and Tremblay, if you know Richard. This was done in the summer, and they reported 16.8% general prevalence of ADD, attentional deficit, without the hyperactivity. There was a very serious prevalence study done by Edith Cowan University in Australia, reporting 20%. And this is actually more serious because the children with ADD, the children with poor attention, they have the highest rates of school dropout. Probably because they fly below the radar. Probably because they just don't get the attention that they needed. Are you starting to get a picture here of what it's like to be a teacher today? Should we talk about anxiety? Okay, so Jeff has promised me that he will twist some arms to get me some data. We are seeing an explosion of problems in anxiety, either general anxiety disorder or this, what Jeff and I were talking about this morning was what we're really concerned about is there's been so much concentration in the media on children that have a diagnosable mental illness that we're overlooking this huge sea of kids that are not mentally ill, but neither are they mentally healthy. And these are the kids that by the time they become adolescents, we start to get more and more internalizing or externalizing disorders, more and more serious problems that are going to affect their overall well-being. So something is happening, and our job at our institute was to try to figure out what are the many causes behind all this. There was a very interesting study that was done in 2001, which has been replicated twice. The first study was done by Sarah Rim-Kaufman, showing that 53% of all school children in SK or grade 1 can't self-regulate. This is very worrying, okay? If a kid at that age can't self-regulate, then the trajectory will get worse and worse. So it became very important for us to try to figure out what does this mean? What does self-regulation actually mean? And what can we do about it? That's the key, because I'm not in the business of collecting data. I'm in the business of finding out if interventions actually work. That's what we do at our institute. So we study these things very carefully to see, can we change trajectories? And can we do it in a school system. I can change trajectories. I don't know if you know what we do for a living, but there was a very nice piece on CBC The National about our study. It's a multi-year study, and it was very successful. However, that's a clinical setting where the families get to meet with a team of therapists, 4 therapists, every week for 2 hours. Now, it's a relational model, so what that means is that the parents are the ones who are actually delivering the therapy. And I should just tell you that I was telling Jim this last night, the most significant finding that we made is the one finding that, of course, the National didn't pick up. Parents to join this study, this was what's called a randomized controlled trial, so this was really rigorous, and it was done on kids with autism because children with autism represent your most extreme challenge of self-regulation. And the thinking was that if we can get these children to self-regulate, we can do it with any child. So the parents at the beginning of the study, they get 1 year free therapy, hours a week, and whatever the kid needs, that kid's going to get. But they had to sign a contract, and the contract stated that they'll keep logs and they have to do a minimum of 20 hours a week. Think about it for a second, right? You've got a kid with autism and you've got to do, it's called DIR. You've got to do this intervention at home, almost 4 hours a day. Our parents on average did 26 hours. Yet we got a parental satisfaction of 94%. That's very interesting. In fact, when you studied the data, you saw something very interesting. We measure parental stress at the beginning, the 3-month point, and then at the end. At the 3-month point, parental stress had gone up quite significantly. Well, that makes sense. They're doing a lot of work and learning new skills and learning how to, it's called reframe a child's behavior, try to figure out what's going on. At the end of the year, parental stress dropped 42%. This is an astonishing result. So it told us right away that self-regulation is as much a story about parental well-being, as much a story about parental self-regulation as it is about the child's. And in fact, the next stage that I'll explain in a couple of minutes is we went on and did the same thing with teachers and got the same results. And this is an important message we have to get through to the teachers, and I hope it'll be a message that you'll be the ones that will deliver. So the way our thinking was going was we have to understand very carefully why we are seeing this explosion of problems. First, we have to understand why, and then we can start to figure out what we can do about it. And I had been studying self-regulation for some time, and we study self-regulation at multiple levels. So we study self-regulation at 5 levels, and I can't do this today properly. And I would like to encourage you today to read Calm, Alert, and Learning. And then if you do start to work with us, I'm going to insist that you read Calm, Alert, and Learning. Because what we've done is we've used all kinds of experts to come up with strategies for the 5 domains. And these 5 domains are important. The first domain is physiological. I'll come back to that in 1 second. Physiological. The second is emotional regulation. The third is cognitive. The fourth is social. And the fifth, which is just as important, is prosocial, empathy. Okay, so why this emphasis on the first level, the physiological? Because self-regulation, properly understood, is a story about how effectively and efficiently a child deals with stress and then recovers from the effort. Every time a child has a stressor, they have to burn, they literally stimulate adrenaline and epinephrine to deal with that stressor, to deal with that challenge. And then they have to recover from this. So I know Ren insisted I'm not allowed to use physiological terms, but I don't know where he's sitting, so oops. Oh, he's watching me. The 2 systems here are the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And the sympathetic system, the sympathetic nervous system, is basically a gas pedal. Every time you have a stressor, you put your foot on the gas. Every breath you take, every single breath, you put your foot on the sympathetic, releases adrenaline, which expands your lungs, raises your heart rate a little. It raises your blood pressure, and then you pause. It's called an expiratory pause after, and then when you breathe out, the parasympathetic is your brake, and it secretes cortisol, and that is your recovery system, and it brings the heart rate down. It lets the lungs collapse. It brings blood pressure down. So every single breath, these two things are balancing one another. It's a fascinating mechanism, okay? If a child has too much stress, if a child is putting his foot on the gas pedal too much adrenaline, the brake wears out. The parasympathetic loses its elasticity, its resilience. It loses its ability to recover, to bring the system back to this, it's called a homeostatic balance, where the adrenaline is calmed down now. I'll give you a real simple example of this. A couple of weeks ago, I had to drive out to, I was going out to Hamilton, and I got stuck in a huge traffic jam in Toronto. And there's this guy in a little white Accord, Honda Accord, and he's in front of me, and his head's barely peeping up above the seat, and he's darting in and out of this traffic jam. So he cut me off a good half dozen times. And we get to the end of the traffic jam, and wouldn't you know it, the guy's still right in front of me. But he's cut me off now at least half a dozen times. And I swear to God, if I could have, I would have beat the crap out of him. So then the next thing that happened was I never speed. It's not worth it. And I found myself driving 140. So one of the things that happens is, because I'd had too much, every time he cut me off, I get a surge of adrenaline. And so by the end of this traffic jam, my braking system had lost its capacity to bring me back down to baseline. There was too much adrenaline now that's flooding through the system. And when that happens, you become highly impulsive. You find it much more difficult to inhibit distractors. You find it much more difficult to modulate your emotions. And so on and so on and so on. You actually find it much more difficult to read affect cues, to read body language. All of this can be tied in to the way these two systems work. This is fascinating, because it tells us that we need to reframe. We have to reframe through this lens children's behavior. It tells us that the kid who's highly impulsive, the kid who is having a lot of trouble paying attention, who's withdrawn, daydreaming, who can't engage, doesn't even hear his name, the kid who's hyperactive, who's aggressive, all of these children, what they're actually demonstrating are signs of excessive adrenaline. Signs of excessive stress in their lives. So it wasn't that the kid's a bad kid. It wasn't that it's not that the kid is weak. It's not that the kid's not applying himself. It's that this child is like me behind the stupid idiot, that there's too many stressors going on. Okay, so here's the most important thing that, you know what, I'm still only on your first card. I don't think we're going to get through them all. There was a study done last year by a woman called Jean Twenge. She's very good. She wrote a book called Generation Me. It's a very good book. And she found some data from 1936 measuring children's, essentially, these are called problematic behaviors. So problematic behaviors, what we want to get at is this huge sea of kids, the kids that aren't mentally ill. Well, we want to include them too, the kids that are mentally ill, but also the kids who may not be mentally ill, but neither are they mentally healthy. All right? And she could compare, she used the instrument that they used, which was the Minnesota Multiple Personality Inventory. She used it on a current crop of kids. And what she reported was that stress levels today are 5 times what they were at the height of the Great Depression. So, what does she mean? That's our job. That's our business. This is what we look at. And so the first step in this process of understanding self-regulation is to understand what we mean by stress. So I've said to you, stress is this, self-regulation is this mechanism for dealing with a stressor and then recovering. And that if you have too much stress, then you lose that ability to recover, which makes you very vulnerable to problematic behavior. So what exactly are all these guys talking about when they talk about this heightened level of stress? Are they talking about psychosocial stressors? That's how we interpret stress, right? We interpret stress as a psychosocial phenomenon. We talk about the stress of, trying to look good in front of your peers. Yeah, that's certainly a stressor, especially for adolescents, and phenomena like Facebook are making it a very serious issue. There was a study done by Kathy Thomas at Napier University last year reporting the correlation between internalizing disorders and use of Facebook. And it's a 0.8 correlation. This is a scary phenomenon, okay, for a vulnerable child. For a child who's vulnerable, whose only social, you know what, let me just explain this very carefully. Can I do just a little bit of brain stuff? The brain goes through 3 brain explosions, 3 periods of heightened brain plasticity. The first one is 0 to 3, the second one is 10 to 12, and the third one occurs around the ages of 18 to 20. So what do we mean? We talk about the pre-pubertal brain explosion. What does that mean? When the child is born, they have a very small percentage of their brain, only between 1/4 and 1/5 of their brain. And the brain explodes at birth. The child's born, and we talk about the child as literally being like a fetus outside the womb. All of our children, all of our babies are born prematurely. Human babies are premature. The theory is called secondary altriciality. And I've written lots about this. I don't want to talk about it now. The key here is that at the moment of birth, the brain explodes. Outside the womb, it explodes. 700 synapses form every single second for the first year of life. So it's exploding and adapting, and it's adapting to its environment. And unfortunately, if that environment is a highly stressful environment, then the baby is adapting to a highly stressful, it's setting up a hair trigger stress response. Okay, so if the baby's exposed to violence or neglect, this is very serious, as everybody here knows, for long-term mental well-being. At the age of 6.5, by the age of 6.5, 95% of the brain's growth has now been completed. The brain at this point, the brain of a 7-year-old is very stable. It's everything, all the core systems, language, reflective thinking, these have all become highly entrenched. And then nature has another brain explosion. This makes no sense. Why would you do this? In fact, one of the world's leading neuroscientists who studies this says that the age 10 actually rivals the age of 2 for what he calls, this is Harry Chugani, for what he calls brain discombobulation. Why would nature do this? It makes no sense. Well, there's a very interesting reason why. Children cannot regulate themselves. They need their parents or an adult to regulate them. And it is by being regulated that a child develops the ability to self-regulate. These systems that I just mentioned that are exploding after birth in the prefrontal cortex get wired in these back and forth interactions with your parents where they soothe the baby. A baby can't soothe itself. A child can't soothe itself. The parent soothes the child. And we do it by stroking them or calm down, it's okay. And what happens is the parts of the brain that are exploding learn how to do this for itself, and the kid goes on to do it. So the primary mode of regulation in the first 7-8 years of life is parental, top-down, parent. It's called dyadic regulation, okay? Now nature had a problem. I got to get these kids out of the house because they're going to stay here until they're 30. But we couldn't have survived as a species if we had to keep on caring for them. And so what nature did, which is absolutely fascinating, is that when the brain reorganizes at puberty, not only is it reorganizing around the sexual hormones, it is also reorganizing from parental regulation to peer co-regulation. Quite literally, the brain is now wiring to become a member of a group. It's no longer mommy and daddy that are going to be the regulating force in your life. It's now going to become your friends. And in fact, there are other mechanisms that are quite literally forcing the child, driving the child to seek autonomy, to seek independence from mom and dad. But how do young adolescents regulate each other? Well, they do it the same way. They do it the way mom and dad did it. They did it. Watch them. Watch a group. When we do this properly, I show a video of the Canada-US 2011 World Juniors game where we beat the Americans 2011. This video does not go down well when I'm in the States. And I don't know if you remember that game, so we won 4-1. And so the score is now, it's 1-0, and then our goalie lets in a soft goal through the 5-hole. And at this point, if he was a Vancouver fan, everybody would have yelled at him. But they're used to that now, or they were used to it. And mind you, Luongo's gone now, isn't he? What the kids do, these are 16-year-olds, and it's worth watching it in slow motion. Nobody yells at him. Instead, they all skate up to him, and they pat him. And they say something. We don't know what they're saying. What they are doing is upregulating him. Instinctively, what they're doing is don't let it get you down, because they know that the more he is locked in a negative, the more anxious he becomes, the more soft goals he's going to let in. So instinctively, they know they've got to upregulate him. This is what teens do for each other. And they do it in all kinds of ways. And they need to do this. And they need to develop these skills themselves. And now think about Facebook. If an adolescent's only social interaction is coming through Facebook, which is increasingly becoming the case, what they have is a surrogate form of social interaction without any possibility for those regulating behaviors, the voice, the eye gaze. So if we want to help these kids, and we see it, you've all seen it, these kids who really don't, I was working with one kid who was telling me he had friends all over the world. He didn't have a single friend, not one. He never spent time with any kids. It was all done through the computer, and he had a very serious depression. Okay, so they need this, and so it's part of the reason why we do the brain science. It's to try to figure out, well, if that's what your science is telling you, what should you be doing with an adolescent? Well, that's easy, right? What we should be doing is we got to get them in groups, and they have to be healthy groups, and they have to be groups that are engaged in risky behaviors. It's essential. This is another story about the brain. It's essential that adolescents, that teens are engaged taking risks. But we want to set the risks. I will. Wait a second. How much time have I got? I still got. I don't know. I promise I will do it. It's in my mind. This is a role. This right now is a role. So what we want to do is think about the Canadian juniors, right? So what the Canadian juniors are doing are taking outrageous risks. But there's a coach there. And he's still exercising a very strong disciplinary role. He's helping them manage themselves. And we're working with a case right now of a young girl who's doing unbelievable. She's very unathletic. There was no chance we could have gotten her into sports, but she was a fabulous singer. This was a kid with enormous anxiety issues, and she's currently at a school. She joined a very prestigious choir, and she just sang her first solos. Talk about risk. So these are the kinds of risks we want them taking with their peers. Okay, so what does Ren want me to talk to you about? When we look at stress, we look at it for the different ages. There are different kinds of stresses. So for a teen, it is a stressor not being involved with other kids face-to-face. That's a huge stressor. We know categorically that television and video games are stressors. Physiological stressors. Just think about it this way. Forget about the content. Everybody here knows about the content. We know that this is stressful in itself, being exposed to these things. The brain consumes 20% of the body's energy. The visual system consumes 65% of the brain's energy. So by spending 4 hours a day in front of a TV and another 3 hours a day in front of a computer, what's happening is these systems that are designed to keep them locked on the screen are a huge metabolic cost. But there's follow-through effects too, because they are not exercising. They're not, whatever it is, that is a naturally self-regulating thing. So everything starts to compound. And one of the problems that we have is a generation of teenagers that are 2 hours underslept and a generation of children that are 2 hours underslept. All of our kids are underslept. Even our babies are underslept compared to just a decade ago. So this starts to expand our understanding of stress. A stressor is anything that requires the body to burn up its glucose. The body to burn glucose, that's what adrenaline does. It basically burns glucose. So the stressors could be environmental. It could be the stress of living in the city. It could be the stress of noise. It can be the stress of light. It could be social. It could be the stress of a family that's overstressed. It can be physiological. It can be environmental. It can be emotional. We divide emotions into two categories, positive and negative. Negative emotions, fear, anger, sadness, frustration, anxiety, burn enormous amounts of energy. And paradoxically, positive emotions release neurochemicals which create energy. So for us, the first thing that we look at is the child dominated by negative emotions? This will further drain their nervous system. It sets up a compounding effect. Okay, just 2 more minutes and then I'll do it. Parents don't understand this. That's just ballpark that. This is new stuff. Parents don't, even well-meaning parents don't understand this stuff. Okay. So you can see how our understanding of stress is growing very quickly now. And things that we wouldn't previously have regarded as a stressor, we now understand is even the way we have designed our classrooms, our physical classrooms, are stressors. And it's very stressful, but there's a fascinating study came out this summer, the stresses of going to a high school of 1,500 kids. It's a huge stressor. That many kids, it's too hard. Okay, so we have to figure out that we can't change the school system, so we have to figure out ways of creating these, what does Teresa call it? Like these connections within that environment. It's doable. Okay, here's the point. So you're beginning to understand now why we are seeing the explosion of problematic behaviors, too much stress. And the stress are the stressors that have come partly because of urbanization, partly because of changes in our demographic structure, partly because of, well, mostly because of stuff coming outside of the border, where anything's allowed to happen if it makes a buck. But these are all very dysregulating for children and their families. And you pick your category, and I can tell you a story about it. You want to talk about food? I'll tell you why food is so dangerous today. At the level of the brain. It's not a story about obesity. Obesity, the numbers are horrific. 17% obesity, 34% of children that are dangerously overweight. It's a story about addiction. That's really what it is. If you don't believe me, read David Kessler or Robert Thayer. These are both very good guys. It's not about willpower. It's not about weakness. It's about self-regulation. Okay. What we've done is we've created this initiative called the Canadian Self-Regulation Initiative. Now, what you have to understand about this is this was entirely a grassroots phenomenon. All that happened was, I've been talking about this for a while in BC, and so 3 school superintendents, Nanaimo, West Van, and Surrey, took me out to dinner one night and said, this would be great for our staff because we'll be able to help our kids better and we'll be able to help our staff better. So would you come in and just, have your guys, your clinical team, do some workshops with us? Anyways, it sounded like a nice idea because we'd been testing this out, so I agreed. And then the next thing I knew, 3 more were insisting that they get to be part of this initiative. And that was Coquitlam, Bulkley Valley, and Victoria. And these were all friends of mine, so I couldn't say no. And then I asked Mike McKay, who's, Mike is super of Surrey, if he would, manage all this stuff, which he volunteered to do in his whatever free time he has. And then the next thing I hear is, well, there's another 8 districts that are begging to be a part of this. And I said, well, I can't do anymore. My staff have day jobs, and we're donating our time for free. Our clinical, we give clinical advice and all this. So we've created associates. So that's what's happening in this province. This is an entirely bottom-up phenomenon. It is entirely driven by what teachers are asking for. And so what we're looking at, how much time have I got, Ren? I got 15? Okay. I want to give you one example of how this is working. So in Canada today, we have the most extraordinary scientific and educational resources. People that you probably don't know about that have been studying self-regulation. And our mandate is to get them to volunteer their time. We want everybody volunteering here to tell us, how can I deal with certain kinds of obvious stressors? So I'll just do one example, and then I'll tell you the clinical story he wants me to do. We know that of all the stressors on a child, let's just do kids now, K to 6. We know that of all the stressors on children, 7 to 12, ages 7 to 12 years, the single greatest stressor, physiological stressor for a child is noise. We've known this for a long time. So the school boards have, they have mandates, they have criteria for testing noise levels in classrooms. And we're very strict about this. There's just one problem. These tests are done on empty classrooms. So there's a guy at University of Western called Jeff Cruckley who's been studying this. And what he did was he went around from classroom to classroom with a very simple question. What's the real noise level like when the classroom's full? There are 2 things that we measure here. The 2 things that we measure are noise level, decibels, and reverberation. Reverberation is probably not something you're familiar with, but this is actually a very good room. I'm speaking through a mic, yet the reverberation is not bad. And it's because they have carpet on the floors, which absorbs. Reverberation is the speed at which a sound degrades, disappears. And it should be in a classroom, it should be 0.4 seconds. The real rate in classrooms across Ontario is 1.2. So it's roughly speaking 3 times what it should be. So I was fascinated with all this. So what we did was I went down to Western. They have this room that they've created where they can simulate the reverberation and noise levels of a typical classroom. So they had me sit in a seat, and you're surrounded by a bank of machines. And they had the classroom designed at where it should be, 0.4. And then they had a person standing in front of me, and she's the teacher, and she's reading a lesson. At 0.4, I could follow her effortlessly. And then they slowly raised the reverberation level. And they did it by they had one person standing beside her, and he started to go rhubarb, rhubarb, rhubarb. And at one person, I could still hear her, but I had to work a little bit. Then they had 2 do it. At two people, I was working really, really hard. And at 3 people, that represents the standard reverberation level in an Ontario classroom. At 3 people, I was going in and out. I was now fighting to follow what she was saying. So that was fascinating. Then what we did was we reversed the roles. We reversed the roles by having me become the teacher. At 0.4, I could have talked for 6 hours. When it was up to 1.2, I was exhausted. It was unbelievable how much effort this was taking out of me. And that's not even factoring in the kids that are having the tantrum or the kids that are misbehaving, whatever. So right off the bat now, we get a window, we get a peek at why kids are having trouble, and we get a peek at why we're losing so many teachers. That was a very interesting video before I started. So we're losing, what is it, 40% of the teaching profession every 5 years. 20% attrition, 20% just won't come in. This is becoming, and that's, by the way, the reason why I went through all the statistics at the beginning, so that you understand not just what's happening with our children, but what's happening to our teachers. They are really, really working. But we also know that schools represent the best vehicle that we have to tackle this imploding problem. Because we get these kids for 30 to 35 hours a week. This is a wonderful opportunity to get to know the child, to get the child to learn these strategies for self-regulating. And it's very much a story about self-regulating. So I said to the guys at Western, this is awesome, but we have no money. And they laughed. They said, it costs nothing. It costs nothing to change the reverberation level in a class. You can do it for $5. All you need to do is you can take tennis balls and put them on the bottom of chairs. Because we can't use carpets, the superintendents won't go there. You can build what are called corner traps. And corner traps are, you get a foam waffle board, and you stick them in the corners. They are unbelievable. Any acoustic engineer could tell you this, right? They absorb sound. And then you hang curtains on the wall made of micro suede, which absorb enormous amounts of sound. And if you go into one of these classrooms where it costs absolutely nothing to make this kind of physical transformation, the effect on the child and the effect on the teacher are extraordinary. And that's just one component, because we can do the same thing with visual noise. It's called visual noise, and so on and so on. So that's very much a part of this whole process. And we need a cohort that's going to be working with teachers so that they understand this, that can guide them in this process, and that can teach them, the teachers themselves, about self-regulation. What kinds of things they need to do for themselves as much as the things that they need to do for their kids. So you begin to get a sense of where we're hoping you will run with the ball. But there's an even bigger challenge for us. So this is the case that Rem wanted me to tell you. This is a fascinating case. So this is a kid that came to us, and he was in grade 4. And he was brought to us. He had been identified with a reading problem in grade 1. He had been put into reading recovery in grade 1. And then in grades 2 and 3, he continued with his. He continued in a small group with a reading coach, a very nice reading coach. And the reason he was brought into us was, when we study stress, there are 2 signs of when a child's in a chronic stress condition, and one is when they're really hyper. But the other one, which is every bit, if not more worrying, is when they're very subdued, when they're withdrawing. And not only did he not catch up, when he first started, he was 2 grade levels below, and then he's been slipping over the next couple of years. So he's not catching up. And the reason they brought him to see us when he was 10 years old was because he quit all sports, and he was no longer seeing his friends, and all he was doing was going into his room and playing video games. And so mom and dad were worried about his mental well-being. So we draw on various sorts of experts to try to figure out what may be going on with a different child. And I was trained in psychiatry by a man called Stanley Greenspan. And the last thing Stanley ever wrote was a book called The Learning Tree, in which he says that there really isn't such a thing as a learning disorder. That diagnosis represents our failure, not the child's. And so you won't know about this, but there's extraordinary work going on in Canada. There's a woman at Western, for example, Lisa Archibald, who works on kids with working memory deficits. And what they can do with executive function skills training is extraordinary. So, once we understand what's going on with the kid, we can start to tailor our interactions, okay? And really get that kid to come alive. Now, with this kid, obviously, we suspected there's something going on with the visual system, right? I mean, that just jumps out at you. But he had no problem with his eyes. He had 20/20. But for scientists, we look at 2 different things. We look at the physical mechanisms of vision, and we look at visual processing. Now, there has been a revolution in visual processing science over the last 10 years. It's led by an American woman called Christine Roman Lancy. And what she discovered was she started working with children that have CVI, cortical visual impairment. These are the kids that are born blind. And she discovered that if you know what to do, a huge percentage of these children can see. It's an astonishing discovery. So what does she do with them? Well, what she does is she removes all visual noise. So visual noise might be anything moving. She works very hard on the clothes that the instructors wear because the wrong clothes can be visual noise. She works hard on the lighting, all that stuff. Then what she does is she's discovered that you can frame the child's visual presentation with a colored border, or red or yellow border. And what it does is it enables the brain to see. Where before there was too much and it couldn't focus. Now the brain begins to process. She works with contrasts. You know, instead of doing black on white, she discovers which color contrasts enable the brain to process this visual information. One of the most interesting things she has done, it's called visual latency. So for everybody here, we have, our visual latency is basically 0. We process almost instantly what we see. But for a child with CVI, their visual latency may be 2 to 3 minutes. That is an extraordinary discovery. What it means is that it may take that child's brain a couple of minutes to process what they've just seen. But if we push them too fast, too hard, the brain can't keep up. And all we're going to be doing is frustrating that kid, creating anxiety. So by doing all these things and figuring it all out, she showed that they can, in fact, see. And then what you can do, and she has story after story that she's published now of children that were at one point labeled blind that today are reading. So we have a woman in Canada, her name is Lindsay Hillier, and she's been looking at how do you take these ideas and bring them into the classroom? Because we know that this is a continuum, just like with autism. We know it's a continuum, where at one extreme you have the kids with CVI, but at the other end you have the kids that are having problems reading, where it's really a problem in visual processing. And her question is, it's a very simple one. Can we adapt Roman Lancey's ideas so that we help these children that are struggling? Okay? Very interesting idea. With this kid, we suspected that's exactly what was going on. Now, at the age of 10, things were starting to fall apart. So he's getting more and more depressed. And I knew that the problem wasn't the reading coach, because she's a wonderful reading coach. And she had started off with a group of 5 kids, and of the 5 kids, he's the only one left. The other 4 have all graduated. They're all reading at grade level. So we look at the kid, and we could see right away that there was, in fact, some of these problems. So we designed a program it's called visual noise, reduce his visual noise. And we could see in the clinic that this was working. Yet, over the course of that year, this was his grade 5 year. Over the course of his grade 5 year, he didn't progress at all. And the affect got worse. The withdrawal got worse. So we knew something was going on. So we thought, okay, we got to go into the home now. There's something going on. And, you know, your first inclination is to say, well, maybe there's a little bit of, you know, like bullying or something's going on that's really knocking this kid out. So we go see the kid in his home, and every night after school, Mom was making him read his chapter books for an hour to try to help him catch up. And this poor kid, we suspected this was part of the problem, right? Because he's failing. And he knows that this isn't working. So it's getting more and more anxiety, more and more frustration. So I wanted to see what's going on. So I come into the home, and the kid, so this is around 5 o'clock, and the kid's sitting at the kitchen table, and he's got his chapter book in front of him, and Mom is cooking dinner. So she's bustling around, and there's pots and pans clattering. And then his older brother and younger sister are coming in and out of the kitchen. So there's a ton of visual distraction going on here. Also auditory, and he's probably a little sensitive there. And then to top everything off, there's a TV on the counter to the cartoon channel. So, like very gently, like, you're like, why? So mom says, well, the only way I can keep him doing his reading, we negotiated is that he's allowed to keep this on, but he won't watch it. So I suggested to mom that maybe what we should do with this kid is have him do his reading in his room. And what you can do if you're worried about, because she had been told, right, that kids do their homework better if it's done at the kitchen table. She's trying. So I said, well, maybe what we should do with him is have him do his reading in his room, and you can come in every few minutes and check on him and see how it's going. So we go and look at his room, and it's a nightmare. So the walls are covered with posters. He's got hanging down from the ceiling, he's got these flags. He's got, his computer has got a rotating colored cube on it as a screensaver. He's got a TV in the room. So now what we needed to do was tell mom, and by the way, they were great parents. That was not the problem. They were struggling to help their kid. That's important. This was in no way a case where you're walking into a family and there's some sort of neglect, or they were working class parents. They wanted him to succeed. They were as upset as he was, which is actually compounding his problems, right? So we explain everything. We tell them, this is what we think. There's nothing we know that we can't share. So let's find out if this is right. Let's co-problem solve together. And we do it with the kid. We're going to tell the kid exactly, you're not stupid. You're not, it's not like you're weaker than the other kids. It's just like I remember saying to him, I said, I ran for many, many years, and I wore everything out. And so it looked like, when I was 50, I had to give up running because I'd run and everything would seize up on me. And I'm having this conversation with this guy, and he had exactly the same background as me. And he said to me his son had Osgood-Schlatter, and they gave his son these bands that go on the knees. So he tried it, and he couldn't believe it. He started to run again. So I thought, I'm going to try this because it costs $14 a band. So for $28, I'm willing to be wrong. So the bands I'm talking about? So I put the bands on. I'm running again. I'm now running close to 50K a week, and I have not a single problem. My back, that stuff that I wore out, it's still worn out, but with a very simple prosthetic, I can run again. And that's what we want. And I told him this story. I said, you're no different. I said, we've all got something. Everybody's got something. And we just figure it out. We'll figure out something that works for you. And I said, the thing we want to start off with is we want to get rid of all the visual noise, and I want you to do it. And so he did a room makeover. The nicest part of this story is, so he stripped the walls, repainted it, we put carpet on the floor, everything. So he got a perfect environment for his visual system. At the end of that year, he was reading 1 grade level below. Okay, so that's wonderful. But the best part of the story is, that summer, he joined a baseball team. Okay, so what do we take home from this? What we take home is that here we've got this wonderful initiative. We're going to work, we're going to design classrooms, we're going to work with teachers, we're going to have webinars and all this Skype sessions. But if we don't get mom and dad involved in this process, we're going to fail. Because we don't know what's going on in the home. We do know that 9 times out of 10, if a child's having problems with self-regulation, so is the family. But what we don't want to do is we don't want to have parent education lessons. This has been a disaster in Canada. I mean, guys have different views about it. I think it's been a disaster. I wouldn't go. If somebody's forcing me that I have to go to classes on how to be a parent, what we want is we want parents to see that we're partners in this. And you're going to teach us as much. We'll tell you what we know, and you'll tell us and we'll figure it out. And we'll co-problem solve. And in the process, hopefully what's going to happen, and this is very much what we do in our clinic. I told you about the reduction of parental stress, but we use lots and lots of techniques to do this. And one of the things that we'll do is we'll say to parents, we've got little 3-year-olds with autism doing yoga, but we can see that mom is the one who really needs it. So we'll say, look, Joey really needs to do yoga, but at this age, they won't do it unless their parents doing it with them. So we organize parent-child yoga sessions so that she begins to have that awareness, that self-awareness that's missing in her life for good reason. For good reason. Because on top of trying to deal with the child with autism, she's got another 1 or 2 kids, she's got to do all the cooking. You know, this is stressful. But we have to give them those tools so they develop self-awareness, they develop self-regulating strategies so that they know not just what their kid needs, but what they need. So that they understand that they have to reframe what's going on in their child. They have to come up with strategies to reduce the stressors, and then they have to teach the child how to do it for himself. That's what self-regulation is all about. First, you get the child calmly focused. Have I gone over? Okay, 2 minutes and I'll wrap it. Okay, first, I'll do this real fast. First, you get the child calmly focused and alert. Then you tell them this is what calmly and focused and alert feels like. They don't know. Then you teach him. These are the things that when you're hyper, bring you down. Every child's different. There's no recipe here. For some kids, it's going to be listening to music. For some kids, it'll be going for a walk. For some kids, it'll be deep breathing. Whatever works. For some kids, it's actually working with plasticine, Play-Doh. Or what brings you up if the kid's really low. What upregulates you. So first, teach them this is what calmly focused and alert feels like. Second, this is what brings you down or brings you up to get into that zone. Third, this is what you've got to avoid. These are the experiences that you know are going to dysregulate you. Mom and dad need the same. Mom and dads all across, I've seen enough now. Mom and dads need to go through exactly this process. So what we have to do now is we needed a resource, which is what Ren and I have been talking about. We need a resource that's going to work with the kids, that's going to work with the teachers, and that's going to work with the families. The end result of this is a real simple one. I want a society which stops blaming the kids. And I want a society that stops blaming the parent. I certainly want a society that stops blaming the teacher. I don't want to blame anybody. All I want to do is I want to figure out how we can fix this. My goal in all this is real simple. I promise you right now, we are 100% successful at our clinic. 100%. And the criterion of success is the one question that no one's ever asked me. The criterion of success is, I want the child to leave us happy. I can do this with every kid. Now the next step. I got to do this with every family. We want happy families. That's what we want. If they're dysregulated, it's going to be very, very difficult to get into that zone. So we've got to help them. We've got to explain to them. You have to learn this material so that you can explain it to families in terms that they will understand. They will buy in. You don't have to persuade them. The end result, if we are successful in this, if you guys can do what I'm asking of you, the end result will be we will succeed in shutting down all the juvenile detention centers in Canada. This is a travesty. If these kids weren't traumatized before they went in, we will guarantee that they will be when they come out. This is doable. We know enough now how to do this. This is an initiative that doesn't have, there's no roadmap here. It will evolve. It will evolve in ways that I can't anticipate. Right now I'm using a 5-domain model. I wouldn't be surprised if in 10 years' time it's a 2-domain or a 20-domain, I don't know. So what we want, and I will finish on this, Ren, what we want is we want you to learn all this stuff. We want you to become the vehicles for working with the families as well as with the kids and teachers. But then we want this to be a partnership. We want you guys to become self-regulation experts because you're the ones with the hands-on. We're not. We're just clinicians. We want you to tell us, you know what, I love what you guys are doing, but you really don't know schools. These are the things that will succeed in some of the initiatives that are going on. Your province now, you don't know this, but your province is under the spotlight around the world. Your province is seen as becoming the model for how education in the 21st century should look. Did you know this? The Finns are coming to BC now. It's true, Ashley, I'm not making it up. The reason is, it's a very interesting reason. Can I tell them the reason, then I'll stop? Okay. The reason is the Finnish model was a wonderful model for homogenized society. But then for economic reasons, they had to become multicultural, and they haven't been able to cope with these stresses. Whereas for Canada, we opened the doors in this most extraordinary multicultural revolution. But instead of following the American model, which is try to enforce assimilation, we embraced multiculturalism. Yeah, we've had lots of problems. Yeah, we have to do better. We know what the problems are. But nevertheless, not only have we survived this, but look at what's happening here today. Look at the initiatives. Something like the self-regulation initiative. The fact that this is grassroots. The fact that it's driven by teachers, not by ministry, tells you everything you need to know about the staff that you're working with. That's why people are coming to look at you. So I guess the last word for today is, I will continue to do what I'm doing, and you have to do what I'm asking you to do, and for God's sake, please don't screw up.